Please join me in giving a Kansas welcome to Larry Reed.
Thank you, James. Thanks, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you, and happy birthday, happy anniversary to KPI. I can hardly believe it's been 25 years. I am very aware of your 25-year history and very aware of the origin of KPI. Again, because of my old neighbor, George Pearson. We were talking today about how he and I go back 60 years. I just can't fathom that, but we've known each other that many decades. Well, delighted to be with you, and you may have noticed they've got me all wired up here. I got a box over here and a box here and something on my head. That's why I had to take my jacket off, because these days I'm having ever more difficulty getting that button to begin with. And by the time I put two boxes on me, there's no way. I've been trying to lose 20 pounds, but it's not working. I got 27 to go. I'm going to talk to you about liberty, and then I want to relate what I have to say about that to some lessons from ancient history. Well, I know that because you are lovers of what KPI stands for, that liberty is very important to you, right? Wouldn't that be true of everybody here? Of course. It's pretty important stuff. In fact, I often reflect on just how important liberty is. And long ago, I came to the conclusion that it is so important that life without it would be unthinkable. That's how important it is. It isn't just some happy side topic, some sidecar to life. It is what makes life possible. It's what makes life livable. I just can't imagine what it must be like to be, say, a North Korean, always concerned about what you might say, what you might do, or maybe even what you might not say and not do that could bring the state down upon you. I just can't imagine living like that. In any kind of such environment, you're really not living your life. Somebody else is living their life through you, because you don't have the freedom to make the choices that define your life. Liberty is pretty important stuff. I would say that if you could somehow count the number of people, or say the percentage of people who have lived on this planet, all 7+ billion today, and whatever the number of all those who came before might be, that it would be a single-digit percentage of those people who could be said to have lived in any substantial degree of liberty. Most people haven't. Most people who have ever lived have lived in constant fear of the political powers that be. They had to live in some kind of dictatorship. They had to live in constant fear that their life could be snuffed out simply for something they might believe or say. So it's pretty precious. And there are a lot of Americans, a lot of others around the world who have given the supreme sacrifice on its behalf. And that alone should be good reason to come to events like this and support groups like KPI, because if we don't, it can be lost. As President Reagan himself warned us, liberty can be lost in the space of a single generation if people forget what it's all about or lose the courage to stand up on its behalf. Well, what is it? What is liberty? This is one audience where I don't think I really have to tell you what it is. I think you know, but in broad language, liberty is an environment in which you can be yourself. As long as you leave others alone, do no harm to others, as long as you respect their lives, their rights, their choices, their contracts, and you live in peace with other people, liberty says, go at it, be yourself, go as far as your talents can take you. And we have many arguments that we can make on behalf of liberty. In fact, growing up, I think one of the first ones I heard, and for a good while, it was almost the only argument that I heard and used, was what we can call the abundance argument. You've all heard it. People say, well, you should be for liberty and its economic component, freedom, free markets, Because liberty is the one system that produces the greatest material abundance. People in free countries live better than people in unfree countries. And I think that really ought to be beyond dispute. All you have to do is look around the world, visit other places that are not as economically free, and invariably that you will find that they don't live at the same standard that we do. And the further you go down that scale to less and less economic liberty, the more impoverishment you find. The more you go in the other direction, the more economic liberty, the more prosperity, the longer the lifespans are for people in such societies. That ought to be a powerful argument. But you know, these days, it's not enough. In part because of what students are often being told in classrooms. To dismiss the abundance argument, because that sounds selfish and greedy, and it sounds like you're only interested in material things and getting ahead in a material way. So a lot of students that come to our seminars, we find that they're skeptical of that argument. Or they may buy the argument, but they still don't buy the system, or the system of freedom and free markets. They think, well, even if it does produce more stuff, it's not fair. You hear that all the time. Not fair. This guy's got more than that guy. And then in fact, one argument that I have been trying to combat a lot in recent months is the argument that Jesus was a socialist. And that's not our topic tonight, but don't get me going. But I hear that an awful lot. So we have to come up with some additional arguments. It isn't enough just to say you should be for liberty, for freedom and free markets because it produces more stuff. To really be convincing, I think we have to fall back on at least one other. So sometimes I say, well, here's one for you. How about the fact that liberty is what we, as a matter of our nature, are made for? Now, what do I mean by that? If you came from another planet and a totally different species, and your job was to observe human beings on planet Earth and go back and report what you find, describe Earthlings so the folks back home would know what you've met up with, it would seem to me, yeah, some of you are laughing, you're thinking of your neighbor, right? But I would think the first thing, if I were that alien, I would want to go back and say, this is really incredible. There's something like 8 billion of them now, and who knows how many billions more, but every single one of them is different. No two of them are exactly alike. Now that may be more profound than you think. I think it's actually central to the argument for liberty, the understanding that we were not made as a fleet of robots by some central planning programmer who just winds us up and we do, not according to any choice of ours, but whatever that programmer wants us to do. No, we have free will, and we are unique, each and every one of us. And that means that when we lose anybody, we've lost something that is irreplaceable. That also suggests to me that for you to be who you really are, to be the unique individual as you were created, you have to have freedom, right? Or liberty. We use those terms interchangeably, I know. Because if you didn't, then you're not you. If somebody else is making all the decisions that pertain to your life, well then where's the room for you to be who you are? The other person is living his or her life through you. And why do they get to do that? And if they get to do it, why can't we turn the tables and do it to them? So I think it is an inescapable and critically important observation that we are unique creatures, every single one of us. There's no indication, no evidence that the same person has ever lived twice on this earth. And to me, that says, wow, I want you to be who you are. That's why you're here. And you have a purpose. And part of our job in life, I think, is discovering what that purpose is, or purposes. And we can touch on that maybe a little later. Well, that's a powerful argument. May not yet be enough to convince somebody that they should be for liberty and all of its pillars, like the free economy. So we get then to the third argument, which I think is not used enough. And I find myself using it a lot these days because I have found a lot of nods from audiences of people who don't necessarily think like we do. This is a powerful argument that can win over people who don't think of themselves as advocates for liberty. Might write it off as, oh, that sounds like right-wing stuff or whatever. But they'll start nodding their heads when you bring up this third argument, and it is this. Liberty is the only social, political, economic arrangement, the only one of all the isms out there describing different political, economic, social systems. The system of liberty is the only one that requires that we live to high standards of personal character. I want to tell you why that's an important argument. It's the only one. If a people of lousy, rotten character, can they be free? Can they be free citizens? Do you think a free society can exist among lousy, rotten people? For reasons I'll make apparent, I don't think so. In fact, lousy, rotten, dishonest, short-term focused, disrespectful of others kinds of people, they usually wind up sooner or later living under some kind of socialism. You can be a dirtbag and fit right into a socialist system. In fact, if there are enough dirtbags in society, socialism is what you'll get. Because if you do not govern yourself, you will be governed. That's one of the enduring lessons of history. If you don't muster the kind of character that I'll tell you a little bit more about, if you don't do that, and lots of other people don't do it either, you will likely live sooner or later under some kind of dictatorial system. Somebody will knock heads together to bring order out of the chaos, and there go your liberties. So I think it's important for us who believe in liberty to make that connection with people. That liberty and character really are two sides of the same coin. In fact, they're so important together in history that I'm going to make a statement right now that I think is very evident and demonstrable. I stand by it 100%. I defy anybody to give me an exception to it. And that is this, that no country in all of history that lost its character kept its liberties. I haven't found one yet. What do I mean by character? We use that term in a lot of different ways, don't we? Sometimes you hear people say, oh, he's a character. That's not the way I mean it. You can be a character and not have much of it. And I'm using it a little different way. I'm using it this afternoon in this sense. It's a combination or a cluster of personality traits that define each of you. And you can have a cluster of bad ones, in which case you've got bad character, but I want to focus more on the good ones. What are the clusters of, or the cluster of traits that make for a strong, positive character that can have a positive influence in the world and that can make a free society possible? What are those traits? I'll just run through a few of them, and then I want to apply this historically. These aren't in any particular order of importance, but they're right all at the top of my list anyway. I think honesty is an important trait of solid character. I would say if you're a chronically dishonest person, you haven't got good character, even if I didn't know anything else about you. Solid character means you're honest. It means you value truth. And, there's not a day that goes by these days. I wonder if we need to reinforce this more than ever before. There seem to be a lot of people these days who really don't value truth. How many have noticed that? Yeah, it's like I've seen more than ever in my lifetime tendency of people, especially in high places, to lie through their teeth because truth isn't as important to them as something else, fill in the blank, winning the next election or getting some material wealth or who knows what. There are a lot of reasons why people do it, but there's maybe more of it than I've seen in my lifetime. We should be teaching our children that truth is of value in and of itself, and a person of solid character should live a life of truth-seeking. that you want to be on its side. It is by its very definition critically important to our understanding of the world and how we should relate to each other and where we came from and so many other things. Why would you want to be a champion of falsehood for some short-term benefit that you'll later regret? Why would anybody want to do that? Yet I see people doing it all the time. So honesty is important. Being faithful to the truth in all circumstances, putting it as a very high priority in your life. Standing by it, willing to sacrifice for it. Speaking truth to power is just as important. Thank God there have been a lot of people in our history who have spoken truth to power and gone the extra mile, extra many miles on behalf of truth. Gave their lives in some cases, and we're free because of it. So dishonest people are not likely to be a free people. Can you imagine a society of everybody's just lying all the time when they feel that it somehow gives them some short-term advantage? You couldn't trust anybody. You wouldn't make contracts with them. It'd be chaos. And in that chaos, some strong man would sooner or later emerge to bring order. And there go whatever liberties you have left. Honesty is important. Another one is humility. And by humility, I mean kind of intellectual humility, applied to personal knowledge. The recognition that as much as you might know, there's a universe of knowledge out there that you don't yet know. Think about that. That's pretty profound. Because there are a lot of people in the world who act like know-it-alls, right? They know what's best for you. They can plan your life. They can plan an entire economy because they're so smart. Leonard Read, no relation, but he was the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education, wrote a famous essay. How many have read I, Pencil? Okay, well, you know, one of the lessons from that little story is that a pencil, telling the story of how he comes into being, points out that, hey, I'm the result of endless choices and actions of people who don't even know each other, who magically come together through such thing as the price system and the profit motive, and they end up making something like me that you think is simple, but I'm incredibly complex. The eraser comes from this tree in that country, the ferrule comes from the ground in certain places, it has to be fashioned into that ultimate thing that holds the eraser onto the rest of my body. And then the graphite, we have to go find that, dig it up. There are miners, loggers, all kinds of people involved in making a pencil, most of whom don't know very many of the others who are involved in this whole process. But the end result is a marvelous instrument we call a pencil. It's incredibly complex. It's so complex that no one person in the world could entirely from scratch of his own initiative make a pencil. Think about that. You couldn't do it. If somebody said, you go make a pencil, but you can't read a book about it, you can't talk to anybody about it, you can't interview loggers and miners, you just start from scratch, do everything yourself and make a pencil. You could not do it. What does that say about the ability of anybody or a handful of people to plan an economy of 330 million people? I don't know why we ever even spent time having to argue that with, it's preposterous, isn't it? So just a little tip, if you ever run into somebody who think that the politicians know best how to plan everything for us, just point out to them, they can't even make a pencil. Not a one of them knows how to make a pencil. And you're trying to tell me they could plan an economy? Give me a break. It's nonsense. Intellectual humility. When one is humble intellectually, what does that do to the way you think and behave? I think it makes you more introspective. You realize, wow, I may have a lot of degrees after my name, but there's still, the day I pass on, there'll be as much information out there I don't yet know as there was when I started. So maybe I ought to just kind of focus on being as knowledgeable as I can be, but I'm never going to put myself in a position where I think I know it all, because that's just not possible. That's a healthy attitude. Another trait of solid character is, and I'll just run through a few more and get into the history part of this. Another one is responsibility. The idea that you feel some sense of obligation for the consequences of your own decisions. A person who's not responsible or a society of largely irresponsible people would look like this. We'd all be sitting around saying, it's your fault. You did it. No, I didn't do anything wrong. It's your fault. You owe me a living. Can you have freedom in that kind of environment? No, you got to step up to the plate and hold yourself accountable and learn from your mistakes and pass along the good things you've learned from them to your children. Responsibility, that's critical to a free society, as well as strong personal character. An irresponsible person is not going to be fun to hang around. Another attribute of solid character, and this helps explain, I think, America's success as well, is courage. Courage. Why is courage important? Why should that make a difference? The world is full of people who will be happy to take your liberties from you at the drop of a hat if they thought they could get away with it. That's always been the case. Always been the case. So people who believe in it can't just be timid, can't sit back and be rolled over. Otherwise, your liberties will be gone. We have to rise to the occasion. We have to be courageous. We have to decide what is it that we believe so strongly that it isn't just convenience that brings us to that conclusion, but it's virtue, it's right, it's truth. And so I can stand by those things, come hell or high water. Courage. I can't imagine a free society of timid people. Just not going to happen. You'll get rolled every time. Optimism is another one. I know that these days, for people like us who believe in liberty, you might be discouraged at times because things aren't always going in the right direction. But I try to tell people, you've got to be optimistic. If for no other reason, pessimism is self-fulfilling. All right? Nobody knows the future, right? So a pessimist is in effect saying, oh, I know the future and it's just terrible, so I'm not going to do anything to make it turn out in a different way. We don't know the future. There are many examples in history when all was dark, it seemed, and then all of a sudden there is like a clap of thunder, a confluence of three forces you couldn't have predicted: ideas, events, personalities. Bingo! They come together and make huge change. 1989 was such a year. You look back on that and the demise of the Soviet Empire, and you realize that didn't just suddenly happen overnight. There were forces at work under the surface, and for years, courageous people who were spreading the good word of liberty, often at great risk to themselves. And then we happen to have some great personalities that came along about that same time to help us win the day, like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and John Paul II. What a constellation of people. How privileged we were, most of us here, to have seen such a constellation on the world stage. And then events. All of that came together, bam, huge changes. And that kind of thing happens often without much notice. It's only later that you look back and you realize, wow, a big reason for all that was that good people didn't give up, and they were working quietly, often beneath the surface, sometimes even giving their lives. But they sowed those seeds that sprouted rather suddenly in those glorious events of 1989. I've always told audiences that I find it easy to be an optimist, and I'm not entirely sure why, but I try to encourage people to be optimistic. You'll be a lot more fun to be around. I mean, don't we all know folks who every conversation's a downer? We're losing here, we're losing there, everything's going to hell. And that doesn't really make things go in the right direction. It just kind of dispirits everybody. But I knew from an early age, even when George said I couldn't play football, I knew that, that I was still optimistic somebody would let me play. But I remember my parents and relatives often saying, you're the guy that always sees the glass half full. Where it comes from, I don't know, but I think it's been very helpful to try to look at events and say, yeah, that may seem bad, but there got to be opportunities there. How can we turn that around? How can we put that to good advantage? Who needs to hear the message of the lessons from that bad experience? Let's go tell them. That's the kind of attitude you'll have if you're an optimist, but not if you're a pessimist. And I really realized better than at any other moment how natural optimism was to me when 42 years ago next February, I was driving to Northwood University, which is in Michigan, on a very icy morning. A car turned in front of me. I swerved to miss him and went into a ravine on the left side of the road, and the car rolled a couple times before it ended up upside down. And I remember vividly what went through my mind as the car was rolling, as if it were yesterday. First of all, I was completely and serenely calm about it. Most people would be screaming or freaking out, I suppose, but it didn't bother me. I thought, oh, this is kind of cool. It never happened before. But I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to get a new car out of this. And I did. Well, that's optimism. Well, all of those traits, if you look back into American history and the history of other places in the world that rose to greatness and to considerable liberty, you'll find those traits were present by the bushel during the time that they rose to greatness. And when people came to abandon them, their greatness vanished. And I want to apply this now, if I could, to ancient Rome. I'm dealing with 2,000 years of history, but I'm going to condense it into a few minutes. Ancient Roman history actually has a 1,000-year span, almost to the number. About 500 years as a republic, followed by, when the republic degenerated, 500 years as an imperial autocracy, as a dictatorship. Lots of people like to talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, and I find that fascinating too, but I think it's the first 500 years where we find the most interesting lessons and parallels. The empire was a very different place than the period of the Republic. The empire, people had gone to seed, you might say, in so many ways, and they'd bought into the notion that there should be a strong man. And the values that had given rise to their greatness and their liberties in the first 500 years were pretty much gone. So we should be asking ourselves, how did that happen? How did Rome build a republic with the greatest degree of individual freedom, with all of its flaws? They even had slavery throughout that period. Not everybody enjoyed those freedoms, but nonetheless, they took freedom to a height that nobody in the world up until that point had ever seen. And it was so admirable, in fact, that America's founders, all those centuries later, would study the classics to find out why and how did Rome get it so right for so long, and why did they lose it? It's a pretty important set of lessons, I think, there. In 508 BC, the Romans, which they didn't amount to much at that point, they were just a little village, you might say, on the Tiber in central western Italy. They had a series of 7 kings up to that point. And finally, the last one was so rotten that these people in 508 BC said, we have had enough. And just like Americans in 1776, those ancient Romans said, let's get rid of him. And they did. It took a revolution to do it, but they succeeded. And then they sent the message like a thunderclap. We're not going to have power concentrated in one guy anymore. We're going to diffuse it throughout society to protect our liberties. And then for the next 500 years, if you even hinted that you were an aspiring Roman politician who would someday like to be a king, you'd probably get stabbed. Because Romans didn't want anything to do with all power concentrated in the hands of one man. So they set up a republic. They had a senate made up of mostly the city's nobles, people who had family lineage going back to the legendary founding of Rome 250 years before. And we all know about the Senate, but you may not know that they also had elected popular assemblies. And for a few hundred years, there were a lot of contentious political disputes between the two groups. But they managed to resolve those and build this phenomenal republic in a little corner of Italy that would come to dominate the entire Mediterranean. Well, how did they do it? They diffused power. They created such things as, and this will ring a bell with you, habeas corpus, separation of powers, term limits. They created not one person or a position for one at the top, but a position called consul that would be held by two people. They said, we're going to start right at the top, and the top person's only going to be there for 1 year, and there's going to be two of them, and they have to agree. The decisions of one can veto those of the other. Tie their hands. Make them have to work together and arrive at some consensus before they can impose anything on the rest of us. Well, they had courage, or they couldn't have revolted. They had responsibility. They had, in fact, there were Roman words for some of these things, like incontinentia, which meant self-discipline, gravitas, seriousness of purpose, honor, believing strongly in the values that hold us all together. There was consensus for several hundred years in Rome, consensus around some core virtues and values that defined the Roman Republic. Like we had a lot of consensus in America for a good while. Now, we split on the issue of slavery for a time, but then we got back together. But for most of our history, we've had a consensus of what it means to be an American. And that has served us well. And you'll find that civilizations that enter a period of decline, one of the first hallmarks of that, at least in their political operations, is a decline of consensus. Instead of, looking for ways to get along and to compromise, to not feel as though you got to get the whole loaf, they would say, okay, you have that, we'll take this, let's work things out. Increasingly in ancient Rome, in the late Republic, you find they couldn't work around problems because sides were so polarized. They said, hey, my side or my way or the highway. And so political debates in the Senate and the popular assemblies became so contentious that they spilled over onto the battlefield. The last 100 years, actually to be more precise, about 90 years of the Roman Republic were decisive. And when I say 90 years, sometimes people say, oh, how long did it take for Rome to decline? Oh, my teacher said it was hundreds of years. So even if we're in trouble, we got a long time, we'll be gone before it happens. In ancient Rome, the Republic, about 90 years from when the decline began to when they lost it all. When did it begin, the decline? It began in the 140s BC. If I had to identify what were the forces that brought the Republic down over that 90-year period, I would say there were three clearly identifiable. One is costly foreign adventures. When increasingly the Roman Republic would say, hey, those people over there, let's go grab their stuff. And there was a time when Rome's foreign policy consisted of, hey, we defend ourselves, we may defend friends, but we don't go take people's stuff. But late in the Republic, they started doing more of that. In fact, in the year 146, two important events happened. You can't maybe blame the Romans entirely for the first one because they had a mortal enemy. But some of this attitude of foreign adventure and takeover and plunder and so forth was at work here. In 146, you had the end of the third and final Punic War with Carthage. Rome defeated its enemy in North Africa, the Empire of Carthage, crushed Carthage forever. Same year, they took Corinth in Greece and plundered it. Well, that stuff, that costs money. But if you get a taste for blood like that overseas and you don't discipline it, you might be on the road in the next few years trying to take somebody else's stuff. And that's what happened. Increasingly, the financial burden on these foreign adventures took a toll on the taxpayers of ancient Rome. But that was nothing compared to number two. And the second element in this decline was the rise of the Roman welfare state, which also began in the 140s BC. Two brothers named Gracchus, first one Tiberius, the second one Gaius. They decide to play the populist card and say, hey folks, you know, a lot of the rich people have gotten rich because of favors from the government, giving them land and so forth, and that's not fair to you. And I would kind of buy that if their favors come from some special privilege of government. But the Gracchus brothers thought that the way to remedy that was to start redistributing land. So it kind of got the government for the first time in the business of taking from some and giving to others, using government as a redistributive apparatus. Gave people a taste of that, and it was Gaius II. He comes to power a few years after his brother Tiberius was assassinated. He's very much involved in adding the popular dole to Roman life, where they started subsidizing grain. Eventually they would give grain away for free. When Julius Caesar makes his appearance in the middle part of the next century, he will discover that about a third of the city of Rome, the city of 1 million people, were on welfare. That's how, in just a couple, 3 generations, they went to expecting government to be the source of their livelihoods. Howard Kirshner, a late great economist, summed it up in what he called Kirshner's first law. He said, when a self-governing people confer upon their government the power to take from some and give to others, the process will not stop until the last bone of the last taxpayer is picked bare. Now, the only quarrel I would have with that is, it kind of sounds like if you start down that path, there's no turning back. I don't believe that, or I wouldn't be involved in education. KPI doesn't believe that, or they wouldn't be what they're doing. We know we can change minds if we reach those minds and those hearts and get people to understand what they're doing to themselves, what the long-run consequences are of things like dependency upon politicians. The third reason, and by the way, in ancient Rome in that last century, the dole, although it was cut back from time to time, depending on who was in office, it continued to grow and would grow even through the period of the empire. It was almost 300 AD, well into the empire period, when one emperor, Aurelian, decided to make the right to relief or welfare hereditary. If your parents got it, you were entitled as being a son or daughter, as you were just automatically entitled to it. And it wasn't just free grain anymore. He added all kinds of things like free salt, free pork, free olive oil, other staples of the Roman diet, making people dependent upon the government for their livelihoods. The third factor in explaining the decline of the Republic was the compromise of constitutional principles in the service of the first two. The compromise of constitutional principle. Rome had a constitution, but like the British, it was an unwritten one. But it was, for centuries, deeply embedded in the hearts of Roman citizens. It was like a constitution by consensus and precedent and custom. And you just do things that way, or if you don't, you better have a good reason and explain what it is and get the public to support it. The term limits, in fact, were one aspect of the Constitution. Consuls, those top positions, 1 year was all they could serve. 1 year. What do you find in the latter part of the Republic, the last 90 years or so? Time and again, people would find reason to compromise or forget their own constitution because that's what it was required to get something else they were after. Somebody would say, look, I know the Constitution says this, but we really need to do that. One guy, Emeritus, becomes consul, not for just the one term that was the limit in the Constitution, but 7 times. And each time there were doubters saying, wait a minute, that's not right, we're not supposed to do that. But there were enough people who said, oh, but he's doing wonderful things for us. Look at the stuff he's getting us. Yeah, we can't do without him, so let him serve another year. All across the board, you find rising corruption, the disdain for the very document that's made Rome great in the first place, or the very principles. And you find that steady erosion. And people have asked, well, when did Rome actually fall, the Roman Republic? And historians differ. Sometimes they say, well, it was when Julius Caesar was made dictator for life, 44 BC, 43 or 44 BC. I say, no, not quite, because that only lasted a month. And Caesar was assassinated, and his assassins were friends of the Republic. They wanted to restore it. So it still had a chance to continue, tattered as it was. Some say, well, it was when Augustus in 27 BC was victorious in his battle with Mark Antony, became the top unquestioned leader, later would become the first emperor and dictator. I say, well, maybe you can argue that date. I think it was, however, the end of the Republic was in 43 BC, when a particular man, we need more like this guy today, a particular man, the last great voice for Roman Republican values, was assassinated, and that was Marcus Tullius Cicero. I have this dream that someday we'll have Cicero societies all over the United States, and its purpose will be to mirror his courage and his eloquence on behalf of liberty. He took off after anybody who wanted to consolidate power in their hands and evade the Constitution. When Mark Antony tried to succeed Julius Caesar as a dictator, Cicero at that point had already held the highest positions in Rome and retired from them. He came out of retirement, went before the Roman Senate, and delivered a series, you can read them to this day, 14 brilliant speeches on behalf of liberty, calling Mark Antony a tyrant in the waiting. Don't let him do this to our republic. And as long as there were voices like his, you could say there was still a chance that Romans would come to their senses. But they didn't. And Mark Antony dispatched an assassin, and he was beheaded in December of 43 BC. I think that's the end of the Roman Republic. But you can't say that it was done by foreigners or invaders. It was not a foreign army that did it. They did it to themselves because they lost their character. No country has ever lost its character and kept its liberties. And with that, I want to close by sharing a statement with you I did up a few years ago that it describes what it is I think America needs to reassert our liberties and put us back on the path that can keep them in place. And it also takes note indirectly of the values that any person of solid character who loves liberty should aspire to. And it goes like this. The world needs more men and women who do not have a price at which they can be bought, who do not borrow from integrity to pay for expediency, who have their priorities straight and in proper order, whose handshake is an ironclad contract, who are not afraid of taking risks to advance what they know to be right, who stand for what's true and not simply what they think others will fall for, and who are honest in all matters, large and small. The world needs more men and women whose ambitions are big enough to include others, who know how to win with grace and lose with dignity, who do not believe that shrewdness and cunning and ruthlessness are the three keys to success, who still have friends they made 20, 30, 40, 60 years ago, who put principle and consistency above politics or personal advancement, and who are not afraid to go against the grain of popular opinion. The world needs more men and women who are humble enough to realize that planning their own lives is a full-time challenge, and are therefore not foolish enough to think they can plan the lives or the economy of millions of others. They don't regard the central government as the highest authority. The world needs more men and women unafraid to take responsibility, adult enough to accept accountability, courageous enough to speak truth to power, and smart enough to express gratitude to others when they deserve it. The world needs more men and women who are tolerant of the differences that make people the unique individuals that they are, who don't feel threatened by opinions or lifestyles or faiths of others who are otherwise peaceful and respectful in their conduct, who are patient enough to win over others through persuasion, not force, who don't demand that politicians improve their lot in life by diminishing that of another, who understand that adding value through production, innovation, and service is a far higher calling than redistributing the property of others at gunpoint. The world needs more men and women who do not forsake what is right just to get consensus because it makes them look good, who know how important it is to lead by example, not by barking orders, who would not have you do something they would not do themselves, who work to turn even the most adverse circumstances into opportunities to learn and improve, who muster the integrity to work for a living instead of voting for one, and who love even those who have done some injustice or unfairness to them. The world, in other words, needs more men and women like Cicero, more men and women who possess those traits honored by time, experience, and good sense, those traits that we collectively call personal character. Thanks, everybody.